Hi, and welcome. You're listening to the X22 Report. My name is Dave, and this is episode 924B, and today's date is March 21st, 2016, and the title of the episode is, As the Syrian Peace Talks Begin to Break Down, U.S. and Turkey Prepare the Next Plan. Let's get into the economic collapse, political, and geopolitical news. Now, out in Ukraine, we see things are starting to move in a direction where Ukraine is making some moves, still shelling and trying to gin something up there. The head of Russia's Security Council has said that the threat of tensions in Crimea remains due to the plans of Ukrainian authorities to use social and ethnic agenda in sowing dissent. The threat of destabilization of the social and political situation in the Crimean Federal District remains urgent. It is not a secret now that Kiev is making plans to destabilize the situation in Crimea. And we see right now they tried with shutting down the electric. They've been shutting down the water. And we see Kiev is building relations with Turkey to control the Black Sea. And we know that the UK is bringing in more military assistance. We know the US has brought in military assistance, still training the armed forces. And we know that Poroshenko has been making remarks that he's going after the southeastern area and Crimea, and they're just waiting for the opportunity. And the shelling of the southeastern area of the Donbass airport is continuing. Nothing has changed there. The central bankers didn't get what they paid for, and they're going to make their move to capture the rest of Ukraine. We see out in Iraq, Washington has sent more U.S. Marines to Iraq to bolster the fight against, yes, the Islamic State. Now remember, the Islamic State was put into power by the U.S. government central bankers. They used them as their proxy army. They were going to be used to remove Assad. Then Russia stepped in and kind of ruined that entire plan. And we see right now that the U.S. is stepping back, reformulating a new plan, and trying to figure out a way to get Assad out. Now, have they created a new plan? Yes, their plan is in motion right now. We see the Shiite militia forces in Iraq have strongly opposed the new U.S. troops deployed in the country. They warn Washington that they should withdraw their troops out of Iraq. Iraq is saying, we really don't want the troops there, but they have given certain permission for troops to come in and help out in certain situations. Now, is the U.S. really helping out? Well, not really. They usually get in the way. And we see that the U.S. still has some pull in Iraq. And we see that Turkey, the U.S., and other nations, they really don't care what Iraq has to say, because they're going to do whatever they want no matter what. Now, Assad has come out, and he is urging all Muslims across the world to unite against terrorism. And he's saying that this is an urgent need for Muslims to show the world that they do not accept, they do not support any type of terrorism around the world whatsoever. And I think this was a very good strategic move on his part, because he's showing that, yes, the Muslims are here. We don't support what's going on. And most of the people that are creating these terrorist acts aren't even Muslim. They're paid mercenaries controlled by government forces, by the central bank. Now, Turkey, they've made a deal with the EU, and they're ready to send 25,000 refugees from Syria to the European Union in exchange for the undocumented migrants, where they've already sent them off to the EU. So now they have documented migrants, and they're going to give that to the EU, and they're going to take back the others. And they're doing a huge exchange. Now, where'd they get these documents? Are they really documented? Did they just make this up? Most likely. But we can see right now, Turkey wants the funds. They lost the revenue from the Islamic State, where they were stealing the oil from Syria, selling it out to many different vendors going through Turkey, and that has completely dried up because Russia came in and destroyed the oil convoys, which now leaves Turkey without revenue for their covert operations. So they blackmailed Europe into giving them funds. We see Turkey right now has introduced a 7-district curfew in the southeast of Turkey, and this curfew is on the Kurds. And we see at this point that Turkey is continually provoking and making their move to get something started in Syria. Now, the U.S., they're saying they're going to launch their new train and equip program to help the Free Syrian Army in Syria. Now, the last training that they did to help the Free Syrian Army completely failed, or did it? Because really what they did was they trained soldiers for the Islamic State. And while they were doing that, they trained a couple dozen for the Free Syrian Army. But most of the training was done to create the terror groups. And as soon as they trained these individuals, they went right over to the Islamic State or al-Nusra or al-Qaeda. And right now, there's a problem with that. And they can't train these individuals to go over to the terrorist groups because they're being destroyed by Russia and Syria. They're losing ground. Remember, the ceasefire does not pertain to them. So the U.S. is saying, okay, we're going to launch the new training and equip program, and we're actually going to train the moderate rebels, and they're going to stay as moderate rebels this time because they're not affected by the bombings from Syria and Russia. So we can see this is the new approach they're taking because they realize they've bought themselves some time here and they're able to build up the forces. Now, who's going to train them? Most likely they'll be training in Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, just like we saw before. And the troops will come in, and this time they'll stay as moderate rebels. This way they can build up the troops in this area. Now, we understand the peace talks are occurring right now. They're not going that well. And what's very interesting is State Department spokesman Kirby outlined the kind of government the U.S. wants to see in Syria. And he says that they don't support self-rule or semi-autonomous zones inside Syria. We want to see a unified whole Syria that has in place a government that is not led by Assad, that is responsive to the Syrian people. Whole, unified, non-sectarian Syria. That's the goal. So the political transition in Geneva, the Syrians are free to come up with whatever kind of system they want. It's up to them to decide, he says. But the United States says they can't have Assad as their leader. So how is that leaving it up to the Syrian people? If the Syrian people say we want Assad as our leader, well, the people have spoken. But Washington will not agree to that. So as long as the Syrian people do what Washington says, they can have freedom and they can have their country as a whole. If they don't agree to what Washington is saying, well, then all bets are off. So what we're seeing here is that, and they're out there saying this, they don't care what the people say. They don't care about freedom, democracy, because they want it a certain way. When I say they, it's Washington, it's the central bankers. They want this their way. And if the people do not agree, guess what? We don't care what you say. We're going to do it anyway. It's the same thing here in the United States. Up to a point, they'll allow the people to speak out. But if the people go in one direction and they want it to go in a different direction, they don't care what the people say. This is dictatorship. This is not an open, free democracy. Now, it seems that the peace talks are starting to break down because they've come up to a point where they're trying to talk about Assad's future. And there is no area in the peace talks that they're supposed to talk about Assad. It's not up for negotiation. But the opposition and the United States government, the central bankers, they want this brought up because this is all they want. They want to talk about what's going to happen to Assad. Now remember, it's going to be left up to the people. The people are going to have an election. The people are going to decide. And we can see already that the United States is very nervous about this because with Russia's help, Assad has gotten rid of a lot of the terrorist threat. They're liberating a lot of towns, a lot of villages, a lot of cities, and the people are going to vote for Assad. Now, of course, we know the United States is going to try to fix the elections, and they're in the process of doing this, but they're very worried about the outcome of this. And we see right now that the Syrian government, they're saying that there is a lack of progress in the ongoing Syrian talks because they're not getting the responses from the opposition. They're kind of stalling on all of this. Now, very interestingly, we're seeing a lot of violations in the ceasefire, where the Free Syrian Army is violating the ceasefire. And Russia has called for an emergency meeting, and the U.S. has rejected Russia's call for an emergency meeting over the ceasefire violations in Syria. Now, why did they do that? Well, they really don't want to discuss what the Free Syrian Army is doing. Remember, the Islamic State is being morphed into the Free Syrian Army, and they're continually fighting in this area. So they have the Islamic State, which is still fighting, and then they have them morph into the Free Syrian Army, where they're saying, listen, you can't fire upon us. So it's becoming very, very confusing who's on which side right now, because the U.S. realizes they can use this to their advantage. But at this point, we see that Syria and Russia, they are continually pushing the Islamic State further and further back. They're liberating all these towns and villages. They've taken over the oil fields, taken over the refineries, and the whole situation is not going well for the proxy army for the United States. And this is why we can see at this point that Turkey and the United States are working together to come up with a new plan. We see it's already in motion, where Turkey is getting hit with a lot of false flags. We're seeing they're blaming it on the Kurds, they're blaming it on the Islamic State, trying to link the two, trying to say it's all coming from Syria. We see out in Syria, Turkish investors are coming in and buying up a lot of the land on the Syrian-Turkish border from the Syrian people. They're buying up homes, estates for pennies on the dollar. And most likely this is to set up a safe zone, to say, listen, we own this land, we're taking it over, we're setting up a safe zone. And their plans are still in motion. They're just trying to figure out a way to push this forward. And they're not going to stop. So we're going to see a lot more false flags occur in this area. We're going to see the false flags spread throughout Europe, because they really need to build this up, because they can't allow the peace talks to go further. They can't allow Assad to stay in power, because remember, the economy at this point is still collapsing. They still need a war to cover this up. And of course, yes, they do believe if they can get into Syria, then get into Iran, they can prop this up for a little bit longer. And if all else fails, they're going to start war. Now, every time they try to push war, Putin's on the other end trying to push peace. Because if Putin really wanted war, there were so many chances up to this point that war could have been started right off the bat. But we see right now that there's a lot of rumbling out there that countries are preparing for attacks by the terrorists. Now, what's really happening is they're letting everyone know they're a lot of false flags that are going to be happening. We see that special forces and other law enforcement agency in London, they're preparing for terror attacks. And they're saying maybe as many as 10 at once. Remember a long time ago, and I mentioned this in many reports, that the next false flag, the main one, is going to be a multi-prong type of an event. It's not going to be a single lone shooter. It's going to be large. It's going to happen in many different areas. And we can see at this point, this is what they're building up to. And we can see out in London, they're preparing there. We see in Paris, they had the largest chemical biological drill. And out in London, we see that officials have also prepared for a potential chemical or biological weapons attack. Now, they need something large to convince the people. This is why they need to go after the Islamic State. They're still using the story that the Islamic State is the bad guy, because most of the world still believes this. Yes, there are a few that know that this is the proxy army of the United States government central bankers. But they're going to do a huge multi-prong type of an event. And I've said this before, it's going to consist of physical attacks, most likely from the Islamic State. And they're going to say, okay, they hit us with chemical, biological. It's going to happen in multiple cities, probably in the UK, throughout Europe and the United States. And then they're going to most likely follow this up with some type of cyber attack from Russia or China or North Korea to show that while the U.S. was busy dealing, or UK or Europe, all of us were busy dealing with these physical attacks, they came in and hit the financial sector. And this would be a way of explaining how the economy completely fell apart. And it would give them the excuse to shut down everything, to put the banks on a bank holiday, and to close everything down where you can't take any of your funds out of the bank. And we can see at this point, this is where they are headed at this time. And you know, once everything gets shut down, once they do this, they will then implement the bail-in documents. And they'll say, okay, a lot of the money has been siphoned off. We don't know where it went. We got hit with the cyber attack. The Fed will have to step in, start hitting us with QE 4, 5, or 6. They'll start printing money like crazy. All eyes will be on going to war with all of these different foes. And we will have World War III at this point. Now, will it happen exactly in this order? Most likely not. But this is the type of scenario that we are looking at this point, because their backs are against the wall. They don't know what else to do. They're coming up with all different plans. And the economy is accelerating and it's collapsing. Doesn't matter what the market's doing. Doesn't matter how much they suppress gold and silver. The real economic indicators are completely falling apart. And there will come a point in time where the reality is that the economies have come to a screeching halt. And it will look kind of ridiculous that more and more people are getting laid off. Companies are laying off. Everyone is standing here going, okay, something is really wrong, because we already see it with consumer confidence, that people throughout Europe, the United States, they don't believe anymore. And they're racing against time right now. And they know it. Listen, everyone, thanks a lot for listening. Be well, be safe, and especially be prepared. Thanks a lot.